I'm joined tonight at the Wheeler Centre by, on my left, your right, Gideon Haigh, journalist and author, prodigious writer on any number of subjects, but in particular on cricket and cricket culture and how cricket relates to culture. On my immediate right, I have Brenda Niall, who's written extensively, including two very fine biographies, both about Martin Boyd, Robin Boyd's uncle, and about the Boyd family themselves. And immediately on Brenda's right is Karen Burns, who's an architectural historian and theorist who works at Monash University. We have at Text republished, I suppose, a few classic old books in our time. And I think that in Australia, our publishing industry has served us very poorly in this respect. We have a kind of amnesia about the most important books in our history. And that amnesia is a really lamentable thing, because the vitality of a culture and the ability, or our ability to have that conversation, which is based on the layers of history which inform it, depends on the availability of the really critical books. And this is a giant of a book. This is an amazing book, and we're now the 6th publisher of it. It's gone through a lot of different editions, but the simple fact is it has been out of print for 30 years, and we're very grateful to Tony Lee from the Boyd Foundation, who came to us with the notion that this book deserved a new publication. And really my hope now is that the book never goes out of print again. It ought not go out of print again, because I don't understand how you can have a discussion about design in Australia, for that matter about how non-fiction gets written in Australia, without reference to this book, and simply astounding that an architect of Boyd's quality and energy and influence was also such an extraordinary writer. Anyway, the book is now freely available again, and as you can see from the discussion in the media, it always was there as a latent force waiting to be rediscovered and to be renewed by the conversations that we're going to have about it, and one of those conversations will be tonight. And I thought I'd start by asking Karen just if she could summarise for us and talk a little bit about Robin Boyd's practice as an architect, and more particularly his influence.
Okay, that's a large question. I think for many architects, the fact that Boyd was such a fine architectural practitioner and designer, and we're very fortunate he's left behind a really fine body of domestic work, much of which is intact, and thanks to a network of aficionados who've bought Boyd's houses. So firstly, I think he's hugely admired because he's such a gifted designer. But in a way, Boyd, in his practice with Grounds and Romberg, there was an extraordinary triumvirate of very talented architects. It's almost as if Le Corbusier, Mies and Gropius got together and set up a practice, for those of you who know the international architectural scene. It was an extraordinary phenomenon, no matter how difficult the falling apart of that practice might have become. So I think there's a sort of mythology around him as well as being part of that extraordinary practice. I think because Boyd was such an admired actor on the international stage of modernism, that he rubbed shoulders with all of the famous international architects, knew them when they came to Australia, they socialised with the Boyds. And I guess because he was an extraordinary voice for the architectural profession, he was an activist. So he was involved in the Age Small Homes Service, and that modernist idea that good design could be available to all. And I guess finally, very rarely do we have public intellectuals that emerge from the discipline of architecture. I was trying to think of comparable examples overseas, and I've been having trouble. Maybe Michael Sorkin, who's a writer in New York, but he's not known as a practising architect. But that's very rare as well. And Boyd was across all of the media, as we saw, and was skillful in using new modes of communication. So he's admirable as a polymath, and I think it's that dual legacy for architects, both as a writer and a designer.
One more question, that the issue right now of urban planning is a very hot one. It's informed by a debate that's happening about proper size of our population. How much does the Australian Ugliness speak to that debate now? Is it a useful reference source for the debate that we have to have right now?
Boyd says that the Australian ugliness is that Australians are unable to be committed to an idea, and I think that's a useful line to think about in terms of the planning debate. And the way I'd rewrite that line is that we're unable to be committed to a complex debate about urban intervention and planning. So, for example, in Melbourne, the debate has largely centred around densification, but there are other models, one proposed by a very important Australian intellectual, Hugh Stretton, who wrote Ideas for Australian Cities in the 1970s, and Hugh argues for decentralisation, which is another quite different model. But I think there's a failure to have a sustained, robust debate around multiple possibilities and to be committed to that kind of idea. But Boyd clearly talks about the need for planned intervention and the failure to be committed on an intellectual level.
If I can just turn to you now, Gideon, I think the thing that struck me most when I reread the book was, as Karen was saying, Boyd's commitment to the value of original thought. And of course, the ability to think for yourself is inseparable from the ability to use words in the way you want to use them, precisely to say what it is that you want to say. And as someone in your position who's written a lot of journalism, a lot of history, and for that matter biography, I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about the writing in the Australian Ugliness and how Boyd goes about communicating his ideas.
It's interesting to me in Australia that that non-fiction writers, and we have a very distinguished tradition, underrated tradition in Australia of non-fiction writing. A lot of our distinguished works have been written by people very young. And if you look at Boyd's career, he's no exception to the rule established by, say, Bernard Smith or Robert Hughes or Germaine Greer or Donald Horne or Geoffrey Blainey, who all wrote very significant books in their late 20s, early 30s. Boyd was 31 when he wrote Australia's Home, which is his history of Australian housing, and he was 39 when he wrote The Australian Ugliness. That to me is a remarkable feat on its own. This is a book which has a very mature, very accomplished, very authoritative voice, and yet it's written by someone who's not even 40. In a sense, it's a collection of essays. Some of the material Boyd had previously published in his various essay writings and newspaper columns, and it's a voice that he's arrived at. I think it's very much it's quite a journalistic voice. Boyd had not come from the academy. The highest academic qualification he had was passing the Architecture Registry Board exam in 1946. He maintained this quite ambivalent relationship about academia all the way through his life, even unto the period where he was anticipated to be the next professor of architecture at Melbourne University. So it's very much it's a voice that aims directly at the lay audience, but it doesn't compromise. It wants to educate and inform and edify the public without necessarily talking down to them. It's wonderfully scintillating prose, yet written in a very unostentatious style. The language is very precise, it's very epigrammatic, it's astringent. It's the voice of that he brought to his writings in the Herald and the Age, particularly beginning in the Age when he was running the small home service in the period immediately after the war. It's a character of prose, it's a character of argument that you would very seldom encounter in Australian non-fiction today. It was interesting to me as I read through it, how would you approach writing The Australian Ugliness now, 50 years later? And I thought it would be very difficult to write a book which had such serious things to say about Australian society without a pretty heavy helping of political punditry, a degree of economic analysis, and probably a blizzard of statistics. You encounter none of these things in The Australian Ugliness. It stands or falls on the quality of its argument and the quality of its prose, and it's a wonderfully refreshing book for all that. It's very much of its time, but it reminds you of where I think our public discourse has become stale and gone wrong in the way in which it tackles its topic.
I think two things come out of what Gideon was saying. One of them is what happened in Australia in that decade and a half after the war, with that explosion of critical perspective on Australia in the hands of astonishingly accomplished writers. You could make a case, putting Patrick White and Christina Stead to one side, that in fact the most animated writing after the war was in Australia was non-fiction, no question, with Greer, Robin Boyd and so on. It would be an interesting discussion to have. But in Robin Boyd's case, he comes out of a family tradition which absolutely understands the value and the power of the written word, and that's at least symbolically embodied through his uncle Martin Boyd. And I wonder, Brenda, if you could talk a little bit about the Boyd family and Robin's sense of writing as something that one naturally did to communicate ideas.
Yes, well, I came to be interested in the Boyd family, asking the question which lots of people ask, I think, what is it that makes one family so dedicated to the idea of creativity over generations that they don't go in for 9-to-5 jobs? They're painters, potters, writers, artists in various media, and they take that for granted. It's just what they do. And where did Robin fit into that? Well, maybe before talking about Robin, I should go back to what I see as the beginning of it, which is a very unexpected marriage back in 1857, which is a long way to go back, but I think it's relevant. In that year, the daughter of a convict, an immensely rich young woman, married the son of the Chief Justice, Sir William à Becket. That marriage brought money into the family, but it was money which had a kind of shame about it. It was kept a secret. And because the money also had, the embarrassment of liquor and pubs, that was something that people did know about, and there was sort of feeling there's a bit something about their Beckets that, you just don't talk about. And that was the liquor, people thought. But there was a big fortune, and one of the daughters of that marriage, Emma Minnie Boyd, became a painter. She was encouraged by her mother, who also encouraged her marriage to another painter who was never going to make a penny in his life, probably, except for that, and that was Arthur Merrick Boyd, and that began what is often called the dynasty of Boyds. So the money is important as an enabling factor. It left them free to create without worrying about having to sell their work. And it carried on until the next generation, when the children, the sons at least, of Emma Minnie and Arthur Merrick Boyd, grew up without really ever thinking that they would have to make their living. That generation was Merrick the potter, Penley the painter, and Martin the novelist. And although 2 depressions really polished off the family fortune, it didn't last forever, the attitude remained that this was something you did and that you didn't really go after gain. They didn't really know quite what an embarrassing heritage they had, but they did, I think, imbibe the idea that money was not the main thing, that creativity was. Now, within that, in the next generation, Robin is the son of Penley Boyd, a very gifted landscape painter who died in a car crash very young, in unhappy circumstances, marriage was breaking up, and Robin's upbringing was rather different from his cousins in that he went towards the professions. He became an architect. He said, he is supposed to have said, because he didn't have the gift that his older brother had of being a painter, but architecture was something the family understood. It was visual. And he also had the gift of writing, which his Uncle Martin, the novelist, had, and there was quite an affinity between them. I think that going towards architecture was a natural progression for Robin Boyd. He was said to have commented from time to time, imagine a Boyd going to an office every day, because none of his cousins did. And that was a beginning, that was different. And he certainly worked hard, wrote, did everything, as Gideon has been saying. He did an enormous amount. But there was always that slight feeling that you shouldn't be too tough and professional. So that may be, we can talk about this, that may be one of the things which made him, while tremendously successful in what he did, not commercially successful. And I do see that as coming to a large extent through the family inheritance.
There were so many colonial fortunes made where the makers of them didn't want to invest, as it were, the capital of that, the creative capital of that, into actually doing things which weren't to do with money. In a way, we were talking earlier with Gideon about a particular passage in the Australian Ugliness which shows very clearly that Boyd understood exactly the relationship between thinking and the value of an idea being caught by what it was worth to be paid for it. When I read that passage in the book, I was reminded of a wonderful anecdote about David Ireland in the 70s when he was on an Australia Council grant at a time when we were getting used to the idea that you could get a grant to do something creative, and he's in a pub and some bloke was upbraiding him for the fact that he was living off the public purse, and he fished into his pocket and pulled out 80 cents and said, "Here you go, mate, here's your bit back." But maybe, Gideon, if you want to read that passage, because it is a very interesting thing, I think, in relation to what Brenda was saying.
Boyd begins, "Some countries, like the USA, recognise the kind of talent required immediately that shows itself, and they feed it well. Australia does not. Perhaps the pioneer, the digger and the Puritan will always resent this kind of talent, or perhaps the reason is simply that Australia at this time is moving too fast to notice if she tramples on tender buds of expression and initiative in the arts. In any event, constructive talent of the kind essential to the initiation of ideas in all fields is given lower rewards proportionally to the country's richness than almost anywhere else. While every man who prints a magazine and every boy on the corner who sells it receives fair payment for his labours, the man whose writing appears in the magazine is often lucky if he clears the cost of his paper and postage. Australian newspapers with respectable circulations are in the habit of paying the National Oracle on any subject 5 or 6 guineas for a special article. Perhaps a dozen painters and as many writers in the whole of Australia make their living solely by practising their art. Visitors from abroad are frequently flabbergasted by being offered a fee for a television appearance of roughly the same sum as their hotel bill for one night, or by being offered nothing at all for a lecture to a richly clad audience. This is the pattern. Nearly everyone who has a part in the presentation of any form of cultural activity, the cameraman, the sound engineer, mechanic, printer, distributor, manager, agent, is protected by unions or professional organisations or trade practices which ensure him a fair share of one of the world's highest living standards. But one member of the team frequently is paid very little or not at all. He is the one who supplied the creative idea which made possible the whole project."
Karen, was it the case we've been talking about the kind of explosion in very, very confident non-fiction in Australia after the war? Was something similar happening in architecture, the idea of the architect as the artisan? Was that, which Boyd would have been a part of, was that kind of movement gathering steam in the 50s?
One of the strong ideas that comes through in the Australian Ugliness is Boyd's determination for architects to be artists. And I hadn't thought about how much that connects him back into the sort of central aspirations of his family. And part of the book very strongly argues against the commercialisation of the built environment and the fact that many of the clients for architecture are corporations and government bodies. So I think there are sort of interesting connections to the family background there. I guess for me, one of the things I'd forgotten about the book is that Boyd is completely in step with international debate around architecture at the time, which is about the disintegration of modernism and the sort of the slowly emerging but very, very important critique of modernism as the central way of making buildings and practising architecture. And there are a couple of key books that come out in the 1960s overseas that we always think of as the central text that really ignite that debate. But Boyd's book, I think, should be placed there as well for several reasons. One is there's a very strong critique of what's called functionalism in the book, which is that the building design is determined according to a very narrow definition of its use. And the other is Boyd's engagement by a new culture of entertainment industries and advertising, which he's very critical of, but that there's a shift in the basis of the economies from old-style, factory production into the new leisure and entertainment industries. And historians have a sort of fancy term that they use, which is called postmodernism. But basically, all it does really simply is describe that shift from a sort of production-based economy to a leisure and entertainment economy. And Boyd is onto that shift and trying to deal with that shift in the issue of commercialisation of the built environment and advertising. So for me, he's very much in tune with where the international debate in architecture is moving to, which I guess I'd never seen before when I read the book all those years ago.